Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at another wine that's grown in the Bolgheri region of Tuscany. The wine concerned is Tenuta Argentiera Ventaglio, and this is actually classified as an IGT Toscana rather than having the Bolgheri or Bolgheri Superiore DOC. The reason I'm interested in this is this wine was given to me by a friend when we were talking about the influence of Cabernet Franc on the wines of Bolgheri, and how the varieties perfume and acidity can be really important in giving balance to otherwise quite rich and ripe Cabernet Sauvignon. And this wine particularly is a single varietal Cabernet Franc from a particular exceptional single vineyard site called Ventaglio. And evidently this is a hilltop site with the vines planted in rows coming down the hill and splayed out like a fan. So Tenuta Argentiera is situated in the Bolgheri region in the Maremma in southern Tuscany, near the southern Tuscan coastline, and more specifically it's located in Donaratico. And Donaratico itself is about a 5 or 10 minute drive south of the village of Bolgheri, making up part of the municipal area of Castagneto Carducci. This is a 153 hectare estate that produces wines from traditional Bordeaux varieties, so principally Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot and Cabernet Franc. Their principal wines tend to be released under the Bolgheri Superiore or Bolgheri DOCs, but they also produce a number of wines with the Toscana IGT designation. Now in total the estate has 80 hectares of vineyards, and these sit on a plateau whose edges sort of create a natural amphitheatre facing the Tyrrhenian Sea. They're at an altitude of up to about 200 metres above sea level, and you have a very favourable microclimate here, with good sunlight and warm conditions that are moderated by cooling sea breezes that are able to penetrate the canopy and reduce moisture, thus also reducing the threat of mildew. Now the estate was established in 1991 by the Frattini family, and they did this in partnership with Piero Antinori, who brought the local and the winemaking expertise to the project. Now the property had originally been a portion of the ancient Donaratico estate, which had belonged to a noble Florentine family, the Serristori. Now having developed the estate, the Frattini family sold it on to an Austrian entrepreneur in 2016. This was Stanislaus Turnauer, and Stanislaus brought with him a renewed concentration on the idea of sustainability within the estate. Now the name of the estate, Argentiera, relates to the fact that historically these hills had been the site of a number of small silver mines that had been scattered throughout the landscape here. Now the estate extends across a unique biodiversity which alternates areas of Mediterranean scrubland, which evidently enables the formation of corridors of breezes to come from the sea to moderate and dry the climate, and then the vineyards are also surrounded by areas of forestry. Now the wind combines with an excellent variation in temperature between day and night during the period of grape ripening, helping to moderate conditions, retain acidity and also delicate perfumes. Because the vineyard's amphitheatre-like location in the hills actually helps collect reflected sunlight coming from the Tyrrhenian Sea. And the vineyards are divided into 4 distinct areas, of which the tiny Ventaglio enclave of vineyards is the smallest. Ventaglio is the estate's first single vineyard wine. My understanding is that some of the early vintages of it actually contain some Cabernet Sauvignon, but it's now 100% Cabernet Franc entirely from this one single 1.5 hectare plot of vines. And the aim of producing the wine is for it to be the epitome of Cabernet Franc being produced in the Bolgheri region. Now this is a steep vineyard. It's actually at between about 120 and 160 metres above sea level. And as I said earlier, the vines are planted fanning out and actually around a single home oak at the top of a hill with varying exposures. So while most of the vineyard faces west, southwest and south, there are also some vines with a north and northwest exposure. And here the fruit ripens much more slowly. The soils primarily consist of a calcareous clay and are a mixture of clay loam with gravel and limestone pebbles. Planting has been done at a density of 6,000 vines per hectare, and yields are about 60 quintals of grape per hectare. So I think that's about 6 tonnes. Now this is a wine of limited production, and I've seen figures of sort of 2,500 to 3,000 bottles listed, but actually specifically I believe they made 5,000 bottles of this in 2020. Now, climatically, 2020 was quite a generous year. It started quite dry, but there was some rainfall from May onwards. The weather during the summer months was regular and dry. There weren't any specific heat spikes. And then, as often happens in this region, a major storm at the end of August brought 40 millimetres of rain just when the vines most needed water. Because of the need to see the tannins on the Cabernet Franc ripen, in 2020 they actually didn't start harvest until the latter part of September, and by that stage there was an increase in the difference between the day-night temperatures, which was actually very favourable in terms of retaining acidity and perfumes in the wine. Now, for the estate in general, harvest started in the second week of September. However, the Ventaglio vineyard was behind that timeline, with the vines on the south, southwest and west sides of the vineyards being picked on the 24th of September, and those with a north and northwesterly exposure being picked about a week later on October the 1st. Now, the fruit was hand-picked into shallow cages so as to prevent damage on the short journey to the winery, and at the winery the fruit was sorted twice on sorting tables to reject any berries that were damaged and that were underripe, and to remove any matter other than grapes. Now, the grapes were put as whole berries, i.e. they were destemmed but they weren't crushed, into two small conical French oak fermenting vats, and these were in the shape of a truncated cone, so the top of the vat is narrower than the bottom, and what that means is it concentrates the cap of skins in a smaller area, helping to keep more of it submerged at any stage throughout the maceration. Extraction was governed by alternatively pumping juice over the cap of skins and pushing the skins back into the fermenting must. So these procedures were alternated from day to day. Temperatures were controlled to keep them between 28 and 30 degrees Celsius, so relatively extractive without getting too hot and extracting harsh tannin, and maceration was allowed to go on for 25 days. At the end of maceration, the wine was run off into a combination of 225 litre barriques and 500 litre tonneau. Now, I'm told that these were made of French and Austrian oak, so my presumption is that the barriques were probably French oak and the tonneau are more likely to have been Austrian oak. Once in this cooperage, the wine underwent its malolactic conversion before spending 14 months aging in those barrels. And once the wine had been bottled, it was allowed to age for 36 months in bottle prior to release. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? So looking at the colour, it's a deep, dark, relatively vibrant ruby red. There are some more perhaps bright, maybe cherryish notes to the rim there. The wine is not opaque, although the ruby colour is relatively dark. Swirling the wine, it is creating tears on the side of the glass there. The wine is labelled as having 14.5% alcohol, so that was very much to be expected. So let's see what we make of the aromas, shall we? Now, I think one of the areas that Cabernet Franc most adds excitement to a wine is in the area of its perfumes. And this is beautifully perfumed. There really are some very lovely top notes of juicy red fruit, raspberries, mulberries. The raspberries almost having a slight spiciness there, but it's that very pungent juiciness that is the real key to that. Now, there are some savoury and spicy notes that are derived from oak. There's a sort of a slight cedriness. But the fruit aromas I'm getting are much more on the red fruit end of the spectrum. I suppose there's a little bit of sort of black cherry opulence there. Then there are also some sort of quite delicate, slightly dusty tobacco leaf sort of notes. So let's have a taste, shall we? The wine is lovely and plush. There really are some sort of quite herbal notes starting to come through. There's good acidity, and that's directing the way that sort of the red fruits are showing. I've mentioned sort of juicy mulberry and raspberry. This is now developing much more into a sharp, bright, maybe slightly tart red plum note driven by that acidity. There are delicate hints of really quite well integrated cedary spices. The oak's not standing out particularly. There's quite a nice, if somewhat restrained, density of fruit here. The tannins are fine, and the wine seems to have a sort of a midweight, a medium to full body. The mid-palate is showing notes of slightly bitter, dark licorice. There's a concentration there, but at the same time, the entire wine has something of an angularity. There really isn't a big, rich fruit filling out the back palate, instead of which that role is taken on by some quite warming alcohol, which actually rounds out the finish quite nicely. It doesn't feel particularly unbalanced because there's quite a good structure of those really fine tannins across the mid-palate, but perhaps that warmth is actually stopping the beautiful perfumes that I was seeing on the nose from expressing themselves to the full on the finish. The finish is quite structured and shows a nice density of quite plush, plummy red fruit. Maybe there is just a touch of black fruit coming through there, so with a little intensity from damson and bullace. I've mentioned fine tannins. There is quite a plush, fine structure running across the mid-palate. There's a density of black licorice, and I'm getting some mouth-watering notes where there is an interplay between the fine tannins and the good acidity. The finish has good length. Delicate red fruits persist incredibly well, but they're delicate and elegant. But in honesty, I'd like them just to be a little more filled out. Now, as a 6-year-old wine, this should be approaching maturity. Having said that, its concentrated, fresh, but quite angular style is probably one that may repay keeping for a longer period of time. I noticed the drinking window on this is reckoned to be out to 2045, and given the wine's focus, perfume, fine tannins, and relatively high alcohol, it should have everything it needs to age for 20 years. And I think during that period, the fruit will open further, and that may compensate for some of the wine's youthful austerity and leanness. I think this is a fascinating wine to look at because it really does show all the positive elements that Cabernet Franc puts into a blend that can help to enliven and give focus to varieties such as Cabernet Sauvignon in a warm climate, as here in Bolgheri, or perhaps what you see when it's combined with Merlot in somewhere like Saint-Emilion. Looking at the Wine Searcher aggregated critics score, this wine has been very highly rated by critics. It gets an aggregated score of 96 out of 100. I can certainly see it's a beautiful example of Cabernet Franc. I think personally, rating it at the moment, I'd be more likely to give this 94 out of 100. Although I would be happy to add that what I've said about its potential to age could well see it reach a stage where it deserves a higher score than that. There are two other things that concern me about the wine. One is its price. This is actually more expensive than many of the really high-profile wines of the Bolgheri area, Sassicaia, for instance, Ornellaia, Guado al Tasso. And I think that is something that is actually driven by the fact that it's quite a small production wine. That fact, particularly in an appealing vintage such as 2020, will of course make it harder to find and increase prices. But at the same time, I don't think that perhaps it represents such a complete wine as some of the other wines I've mentioned that are likely to be less expensive. My other concern and reservation actually is this is really quite a big, heavy bottle. And while I can understand a producer's desire to have a wine that's well presented and has a presence on a table, I do think that for a winery that wants to focus on sustainability, perhaps a lighter bottle that might reduce the carbon footprint of shipping it would be more appropriate. I perhaps shouldn't end on that note, because this is a wine that I do find vibrant and exciting. While currently its nature seems quite primary, it certainly seems to be a wine that's structured to age. So it is one I'd be really interested to come back to in 10, 15, maybe 20 years to see how it's developed. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you found the tasting as interesting as I have. If you have enjoyed the video, it would be great if you could press the like button for me. That would really help. If you're watching these videos and you haven't subscribed yet, could I perhaps ask you to consider doing that, as the number of followers the channel has really affects the way that I can develop it. To that end, if you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. And if you have any comments or questions, it would be great if you could pop those into the comments box below. I would love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else like that. I will of course leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see if it's available near you, and also you'll be able to see its pricing. So once again, thank you for taking the time to join me for this tasting, and I do hope that sometime in the near future you'll be able to come and join me for another tasting. But until then, bye for now.